But yeah, my name is Matt Schweickle at the University of Wollongong. And as Chloe mentioned today, I'll be going through analyzing qualitative data. So if you didn't get a chance to see the previous one, we just spoke around, I guess, the growing importance of methodological coherence around sampling and doing the interview and transcribing. So this kind of follows directly on from that in your typical method section around how you would write up the data analysis section, as well as actually doing the data analysis, and then approaches to rigour, trustworthiness, and validity. So as I've just mentioned, they were kind of the outline of what we'll be going over today and what we spoke about previously. And just to give a little bit of a reminder of some of the key messages from the previous workshop, this idea of methodological coherence is on the rise. It's really important now if you want to publish research, if you're submitting PhD theses, master's theses. And this basically outlines that your strategic decisions or the decisions you make in your method section should align with your philosophical approach. That's your ontological and epistemological approach. So that means our analytical strategy, the type of analysis we use, should also align with that philosophical approach. And that's what we'll be talking about today. And qualitative research recognizes and really values the role of subjectivity and, more importantly, reflexivity. So subjectivity refers to the biases that we bring based on our own experiences, our knowledge, our beliefs to a study. And then reflexivity is around critically reflecting on the knowledge we produce and how our subjectivity plays into the results that we produce. And as we go through talking about doing a thematic analysis today, I think a lot of these ideas around subjectivity and reflexivity, and maybe if you were struggling to kind of attach them previously to how it would work in practice, will become quite evident of how our beliefs, how our experiences actually play into the coding process. So the first part of today's talk is going to be on doing the analysis. Now, I'm going to be talking about thematic analysis, but there are a range of different analysis methods. So some of the common ones outside of thematic analysis, or in particular reflexive thematic analysis, which I'll be talking about, things such as discourse analysis, interpretive phenomenological analysis, grounded theory, narrative analysis, and conversation analysis. Now, these different types of analysis have their own protocols, and a number of these are also attached to certain philosophical positions already. So if you see something such as interpretive phenomenological analysis, it's probably the hardest one to say, such as IPA, most people will refer it to, has a certain philosophical underpinnings kind of attached to that. Now, my experience is really using thematic analysis, so that's kind of what I'll be talking about today. But if you are embarking on a qualitative project, you're interested in what kind of analysis you would do, I would encourage you to at least have a little bit of a look at different types of analysis, depending on the research questions you have and what you're interested in. Just go to the next slide. Yes, so reflexive thematic analysis. This is probably the most common type of analysis that we see in psychology. And it's a method for identifying patterns, and this is what we refer to as themes, across a data set. So this is a type of cross-case analysis where we would have multiple participants, and we're looking for patterns that exist across a data set. These can be things that are similar, these can be things that are also in conflict, but these kind of shared ideas that are across the data set. And like I said, this is a very common type of analysis, and it really has been led by Brown and Clark, Victoria Brown and actually, I can't remember the first name, so Brown and Clark. And as you can see down here, this is from this morning. I looked at the updated citation rate. So this is the 2006 paper that it was originally published in. There's been a range of papers since then, but it's been cited 173,000 times. So I think it was the most cited academic paper in 2006. So it's had a huge impact, not only within psychology, but also outside of psychology. So there's also a really good textbook. It's a little bit older now. It's from 2013, Successful Qualitative Research, A Practical Guide for Beginners, which Brown and Clark wrote. And that gives a really nice overview of not only thematic analysis, but different approaches to analysis, and also just introducing qualitative research, instructions on interviews, conducting focus groups. So if you're embarking on qualitative research, this might be a resource you want to consider. Brown and Clark have also released a specific thematic analysis textbook, I think 2 years ago. So that will be a bit more recent and speak very much to thematic analysis. But there's also a range of papers that exist on it. So I guess one of the questions that you might have is why thematic analysis? Why, I guess beyond my own experience, is it something that's really popular and something that we're going to talk about it today? So really one of the main reasons I wanted to speak about thematic analysis is that a lot of the principles we'll go through in the coding process, the writing the results, do have a lot of similarities and overlaps with other types of analysis. So some of these skills are relevant to other types of analysis. And it's also a relatively philosophy-free type of analysis. And what I mean by that is that it can be used with other different types of philosophy. It's not embedded to a certain philosophical approach. It does have certain assumptions, which are kind of inherent in the name reflexive thematic analysis. So it is about being reflexive. But it, at least at an ontological level, it's a bit more open, and it can be used with a range of different types of data collection. So these could be interviews, focus groups. You could even use it in a meta synthesis approach. So as I mentioned, thematic analysis can be used to answer most types of research questions. It's a flexible foundational method. So some sort of thematic coding is common across a range of different qualitative approaches. It's only a method of analysis. It doesn't prescribe a specific philosophical position that has to be adopted. And you can also use it inductively and deductively in different ways. So by inductively, I mean where you're, I guess, more led by the data. You're kind of, whilst you're obviously involved in that process, you're very much letting the data kind of dictate what kind of themes and codes are produced. Where a deductive approach, you might be applying a specific type of framework and coding into that. There's some great lectures on YouTube, which you can also look at. Their Twitter profiles are also really good, if they're still using Twitter, or sorry, X, for just like their thoughts, updates on thematic analysis and kind of qualitative methods. So I would encourage you to look at the YouTube videos as well. There's also been a paper recently published around actually some researchers' experiences with using thematic analysis. So it was kind of their own account of conducting thematic analysis, I believe for the first time. So again, if you're interested in kind of learning about it, might be a good resource to look at. Okay, so actually going into the analysis. So there's 6 steps dictated in thematic analysis, but it's important to know that these aren't linear, they're iterative. So at any time you could go back and forth between these steps. It's not the process of you finish step 1, you're done with step 1 before you move to step 2, you're never going to go back. It's a continual process, and that will become quite evident as we talk through doing the results. So the first step is to familiarize yourself with the data. So this means basically becoming really familiar with your data and your project. So if you've conducted the interviews, you're obviously going to be quite familiar already. If you've transcribed, you're going to be quite familiar already. And then you want to read the transcripts initially. And you really want to start reading them with a kind of a data lens applied. So you're reading these as data, you're starting to think about ideas and patterns and meanings that might link to broader psychological or social or theoretical concerns. So you want to be analytical and critical as you're reading in this initial part. And just start making some initial notes. And these don't need to be perfect notes. These don't need to be complete codes or complete themes. They're just kind of some messy thoughts that you might have as you're initially going through this stage, just to kind of get the thinking about what could be going on happening. And then you want to move into, I guess, the coding stage. After you've read, familiarize yourself with the transcripts. And there's no real, I guess, number of how many times to read it or what counts as familiarization. What I would encourage you to do is just really try to engage with it as much as you can. And during the coding process, you're obviously reading and rereading the transcripts as well. So A code is a word or a brief phrase that captures the essence of why you think a particular bit of data may be useful. So a code represents one idea. It's not multiple ideas. It should be a one succinct idea. Although you might have a piece of data that may have multiple codes. So what I mean by that is you might have a sentence or a couple of sentences which you've coded, which actually have a couple different ways it could be read. It could be interpreted in different ways, depending on the type of theoretical lens you applied, depending on how semantic or latent you go with it. And I'll talk about that in a second. So something can be coded in multiple ways, the same piece of qualitative data. And these are really the building blocks of your analysis. So if we're to kind of give a metaphor of what a thematic analysis would look like, your codes are like your bricks or your tiles on this red brick house. So they're the initial kind of building blocks. And then your themes are your roof or your walls. So they're kind of a more complete idea comprised of multiple codes. And then your house would kind of be the overall analysis. So your themes, your walls and your roof kind of come together to build that house. But they're all built on that initial coding process. So you can also do different types of coding. So there's selective coding where you're only collecting data of a certain type. So this might be in response to a specific research question or a specific idea that you're after, which may form part of a pre-analysis. Where the complete coding is identifying anything and everything of interest to answer your research questions across the entire data set. So this is basically, say you had several research questions, you'll just go through the data set and look like anything's of interest. Where selective coding, you might have some sort of pre-established idea applied that you only want to look for certain types of data. And they're both options that you can use depending on the type of research question you have, the aim of your study, what you're trying to get from your data. Typically, I would say complete coding is the one that we see most with thematic analysis, but there's different ways to go about it. Especially if you maybe have transcripts which are looking at multiple studies. Sometimes an interview might comprise, multiple studies that are going to draw from that, and they're about different things. So you might do a bit of selective coding on that. As I mentioned before, there's different ways we can code the data. So there's what we call data-derived codes. So this is where we code data based on the explicit content of the data. So it very much mirrors what the participant has said and mirrors the words they're using, the concepts they're using, the way they've kind of explained it. It's their semantic meaning. And then we have researcher-derived codes. So these are codes where the researcher's conceptual understandings come into play, and we look for the latent meaning. So what's kind of beneath what is being said? Can we apply some sort of concept or idea or theory that we know about to understand what might be going on beneath what is just being said by the participant? Because we know that a lot of participants may not share the same language we use to explain certain concepts. So it might be applying that theoretical lens. And that's where that kind of idea of reflexivity and subjectivity comes into play. We're applying our theoretical lens based on the knowledges we have, based on our experience, based on our knowledge of different theories. And these are kind of a spectrum of approaches. They can be used in the same the same analysis. So often when I'm coding, I might have a piece of data and I might have one code that's a bit more data derived and then one code that's a bit more research derived for that same piece of data. And it could be interpreted in two different ways, depending on kind of what I bring to that analysis. So this coding process can be done through a range of different mediums. One way is to do it via pen and paper. So you can see some examples here of where people have highlighted and then they've kind of cut up some ideas and grouped them together, or they've got a binder and they've used Post-it notes. Personally, I don't do this method, primarily because I find it quite overwhelming how much data I often have in my codes and kind of compiling that and tracking that by pen and paper I find quite difficult. but it can work sometimes. And it is one, we have used it previously in a meta synthesis we conducted where we had hundreds of codes that we had to compile together. And the only way we could kind of do it was to visually, to cut up all the individual pieces of paper with different codes on them and then visually compile them together because we couldn't actually fit it on like a screen to do that. So it can be really handy. And I know a lot of people do this, but I personally don't. But it may be the kind of way that works best for your thinking style. And that's really important as I go through these slides, that with regards to the way we go about doing the thematic analysis, obviously there's the 6 steps that we follow, but kind of whether you use pen and paper or other methods, which I'll go through, it's very much around what works for you. So I would encourage you to try different methods or think about how you might work best and what's going to produce the best analysis for you. Another really common method is NVivo. So NVivo is a software. I know it's one we have here at University of Wollongong. I'm not sure what the licensing is at other universities, but it's basically a software that you can use to conduct coding. It's not something I use because I kind of when I came through it and learned about qualitative analysis, the supervisors I was learning from weren't using it much either. So we never kind of went down that path. But I know a lot of people who have used it really successfully, and obviously something that continues to be improved given it is a software. So I also know you can code different types of data in there, not just interviews. You can look at images and stuff like that and code those as well. I just want to highlight there have been some critiques around using NVivo, and primarily this is around having a really strong sense of the process and knowing what you're kind of doing and how the thematic analysis works. So you don't kind of get pulled or led too much, I guess, by the software in a sense. So this is by Victoria Clark, a tweet. As I mentioned before, Twitter can be a great place to see some insights. And Victoria Clark is one of the authors of the thematic analysis paper that I mentioned before. And they just stated here that a lot of times NVivo based analysis can often end up very fragmented. So this is having a lot of themes and a lot of sub-themes. So it's just something to keep aware of if you are using NVivo, and by no means am I saying not to use it. I'm just saying that there have been some criticisms raised, and it's really important that you know the process and kind of the boundaries of what you want to set before you start ending up potentially with too much fragmentation in your analysis, because that is something we're trying to avoid. The method I use is Excel, which is basically kind of, I guess, a bridge between the different types of methodologies. So Excel gives me the opportunity to be a little bit more messy, a little bit more creative still, have a bit more ownership, but kind of put it all in a way that I find a bit easier to sift through and store lots of data. And then I continuously cut down with new Excel files. I also know some people do it using Word in a similar way. So I would often just organize my analysis with a research question, and then have my transcript on, my other screen. And I literally would go through the transcript. As I see a code, I just put it to the Excel sheet. If it falls under a code I've already developed, I would add it under that code. If it's a new code, I would just make a new code. And I just keep building that analysis in that way. And what you're trying to do with your coding is to come up with a comprehensive set of codes that differentiates between different concepts, issues, and ideas in the data. And you've applied this consistently to the data set. So to be able to apply that consistently to the data set, it's really important that you don't only do this process once. You don't read the first transcript. Say you have 10 transcripts or you've done 10 interviews. You don't do the first one, you finish at 10 and you just move on. You want to come back and go through again, because as you go through your transcripts, what will happen is your ideas around potential codes, potential ideas will change and evolve. And so when you code transcript 10, might be a different frame of mind than when you approach transcript 1. So you want to make sure you do what we call coding sweeps, coming through and making sure you've double checked all the transcripts. And you also want code names that kind of work independently from the data. So Brown and Clark have talked about this idea of a take away the data test. So if you were to take away the example piece of data, would that code still make sense? So often you end up with something that's a couple words and gives a bit of insight into what that code is about, provides the meaning of what the code is about, rather than just kind of an umbrella word, which sometimes we see. So when is coding done? Coding is done is when the codes are nuanced and complex. And my experience with conducting coding is the coding process really doesn't finish until you're generating themes and writing the results, because as you're going through that process, you'll continually be playing with your codes, combining some, maybe breaking some apart, pushing some into themes, depending on where you kind of go with your analysis. So that coding process really doesn't finish until you're actually in the results section and writing it up and you produce that final report. So I know I probably just gave you a lot of information around code. So I just wanted to take a quick chance to pause and just see if anyone has any questions around the coding process before we move on. I'm just struggling to see the chat. I'm just going to stop sharing to see if there's any in the chat. No? All good then. Well, I'll keep an eye on it and then I'll move on. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to throw them in. But if not, I'll continue on. Okay, so once we've done the codes, we move on to the stage of generating themes. So themes capture something important about the data in relation to the research question. And they represent some level of patterned response or meaning within the data set. So themes have a central organizing concept where they contain different ideas or aspects, but they're all related to this central organizing concept or this central idea that unites these different codes. And when you're pulling together your themes, it's not only about the frequency of codes, the frequency of data even. So, you might have lots of quotes under a certain code, but only a couple of quotes under another code. That's okay to then include both of those codes under the theme. It's not about frequency. It's really about kind of how meaningful that data is to your research question. So I've seen that there is a question in the chat around how many people code the data. Do you have two raters for some of the data for inter-rater reliability or not? I will come to that when we talk about rigour, trustworthiness, and validity, because it is a bit of an issue that needs to be unpacked. So I will come back to that question, but thank you. So when you're conducting your themes, when you're generating your themes, you want to go through and you review the coded data, and you start clustering together similar codes. At this stage, you want to consider whether any codes may be promoted into themes. And you also often start cutting down your codes. My experience is a lot of the time you end up with a lot more codes from that initial processing you end up including in the analysis. And really what you're trying to do is capture the codes and the ideas that are most interesting to your research questions. What are the things that are really going to answer my research questions in a meaningful way, in a nuanced way, advance our understanding of what we're trying to explore? Sometimes you might have codes that have a lot of data under them, but aren't that interesting because it's something maybe we know a lot about and you've gone through, you've coded all the transcripts, but it's nothing that's going to add that much to our understanding. So an example of that from my research, for example, which is primarily on performance under pressure in sport. When I conducted a big interview study, there was I had a lot of data around the different sources of pressure. Now, that's a pretty well-established literature base. We know lots of different things cause pressure with regards to, it was a grand final, it was a semi-final, it was an Olympic qualifier, whatever. So I wasn't that interested in that, but what I was interested in is more the nuances of what was going on. So the idea of it was more around athletes' internal expectations playing into it, because that really hadn't been unpacked before, or the idea that actually some athletes felt more pressure in what would be considered from the outside less high pressure events. So maybe a trial game was one athlete talked about feeling more pressure in a trial game than a World Cup qualifier, because the personal stakes that were attached to it were a lot higher. So whilst I could have just reported, there's a lot of things that cause pressure in sport, grand finals, and higher stakes events, that's been really widely reported on, and it really wouldn't add much to the research questions that I was trying to explore. So you really want to focus on the things that are most important to your research question. During this process, you'll also cut a lot of codes, as I was just mentioning. So I looked at one of my analyses from a while ago, and I think I went from 67 codes to 24 codes to 20 codes in the final analysis. And that was primarily through a process of I was coding more research questions at the start, realized I just had too much information. I actually had to cut some research questions and turn that into a new study, because I just wouldn't have been able to get the depth into the research questions I did have if I maintained both of these research questions in the one study. And through that process, I ended up cutting a lot of codes. So once you're in the stage of generating these initial themes, you can also develop a theme summary. So you might have clustered some coded data together. Let's say you've put 5 codes together and you've got a rough idea, okay, this is going to be a theme. What can be really helpful is develop a theme summary of what the theme is saying and what does it mean, before you kind of feel like you need to lock in a theme name. So for example, here's a theme summary that I prepared for one of my analyses, where I've just explained to kind of myself really what I'm trying to say in this theme. What's the key theme that is kind of running through the analysis based on the codes that I've got. And then I'll just put some candidate theme names. So these are just some different ideas I have around what the theme could be called. Actually, what ended up happening with this theme is I split it into 2. There's kind of 2 different ideas I worked out within that theme, and they really needed to be separated. And that was through the process of writing up the results. I kind of worked that out, like, well, actually, there's 2 different things I need to explore here. Another really great way to start understanding your themes, and one of the things that a lot of people struggle with is I guess the boundaries between themes. So as I just mentioned, then I had one theme and I ended up splitting it into 2. So how do I kind of go through that process of understanding, well, what codes fall under what theme, and maybe they fall under multiple themes, and is this one theme or is it 2 themes? This idea of doing thematic maps. So this is basically where we draw out how the themes relate to each other, or even how some of the codes relate to each other, to begin to get an understanding of the different boundaries of the themes. So here's some examples from previous work that I've done. I've done more thematic maps than this. These were just the 2 I found, and I apologize for my poor handwriting. I didn't know they were going to be in a presentation eventually. And these theme names actually ended up all changing. These were just original ideas where I'm just trying to understand how the different themes are relating to each other. Some of these got cut, and some of these got combined, and most of these would have had their names obviously changed. You can see here on the bottom right hand corner, I've also kind of put in some codes around what might be relating with regards to the codes under these themes. These were just kind of my kind of draft ones, but it really helps in understanding how these things relate together. It also helps when you come to write up the results, because it's really important when you write up the results to also think about the order of your themes. So how you present them tells the story of what's going on, and often themes will be related. And in fact, in an analysis, most themes will be related. So you can use previous themes to kind of help tell that story. Is there something that happens in a process before something else that would be better to put that theme up first and then lead into the next one? So for example, in the paper, which was based on the thematic map in the top left one, I kind of started talking about how pressure occurred for athletes, what the key influences were, especially from an internal perspective, how they experienced that during a competition, the fact that it fluctuated, it was episodic, and then kind of how they dealt with their emotional responses to that pressure. So it very much followed a kind of logical structure of how those themes built on upon each other to understand the later themes in context. You can also think of your hierarchy of themes. So there are themes are kind of our key ones we often talk about, but there's also what we call overarching themes. Sometimes these are called superordinate themes and sub-themes. So these are different ways you can structure it. So you might have the case where you have, let's say you have 5 themes in an analysis. You might have 2 or 3 that are really tightly related, and they've got maybe this idea that sits over the top of them, and they might fall under an overarching theme. In a similar manner, you might have multiple themes, but one theme you feel like could be unpacked a little bit more by bringing in some sub-themes. I think it's really important that whilst it can feel like maybe that's a good sign of an analysis to have lots of different levels because it shows a level of complexity, it's really easy to end up having this really complex analysis that's actually quite confusing for the reader when we introduce too many levels and there's too much going on. So sometimes if you have multiple overarching themes, multiple themes, and multiple sub-themes, it can be really hard to kind of get a sense of the structure of the analysis and the hierarchy. So very much just think about these as potential tools that you can use if you feel like it fits the analysis you're doing or the data that you have, rather than something you have to do. So, for example, we've used overarching themes and sub-themes really effectively when we conducted a meta-synthesis. And this meta-synthesis was of all mental health guidelines in sport. And we did complete coding in the sense of we coded everything that was in every guideline. So every sentence that was in every guideline. So there was something like 12 guidelines. Each guidelines that were put out had anywhere between 10 to 30 statements. So we ended up with, like I said before, something like 400 to 500 codes, which all had to go in the analysis because it was a meta synthesis. So it was to include a full spectrum of what was covered. So in that instance, because we had so much data that had to be included in the analysis, we were able to use overarching themes, and sub-themes really effectively to bring in all that data. But in other instances where maybe you can cut some data to be more precise to the research question, maybe you don't have so much data, you may not need to use that much. Okay, so when we come to developing our themes, I guess there's 2 types of themes that we often see. So the first is what we would call a domain summary. And this is pretty typical when we see people doing qualitative analysis that maybe are coming to it for the first time. And this is where we see a theme based on a shared topic, but not a shared meaning. So these will be theme names that are often reflective of the questions we have or the research questions, and it might be like types of or benefits of. And we're really just grouping based on the topic or directly based on the research question. Where what we can try to have is storytelling themes. So these are for really where the theme is more based on the meaning rather than just being organized under a research question or a topic area. And often these are going to be more nuanced and complex and may even sit across multiple research questions. So it's less about just trying to have, okay, I've got 3 research questions, so I need 3 themes which directly answer those 3 research questions. You might have 3 research questions and have multiple themes that speak across different aspects of those research questions. Maybe one theme just speaks to one, maybe one theme speaks to 2. It doesn't have to be fixed in any kind of rules with that regard. And also, what you want with these theme names is that they say something about the data. If we were to just read the theme names, if we were to take away all the data, they would still tell us that story. And I'm going to show you a really, hopefully clear example of what I mean by that, based on a previous paper we had conducted, where we really tried to move from kind of themes which sat with a domain summary, kind of a naming structure at least, to more of a storytelling theme. So after you've generated your initial themes, you want to review these themes. And these are some of the questions you might ask yourself. Is this a theme? Is there a central organizing concept? What is the quality of this theme? What are the boundaries of it? Where does one theme end? Another start? Is there enough data to support the theme? Or is the data too diverse and wide ranging? At this stage, it's really important and helpful to get feedback. Get feedback from your co-authors or your supervisors. This is part of the rigour trustworthiness process, which I'll speak about, and get feedback on how you're going with the theme names. And sorry, with the themes, do the names I'm producing make sense? Do these codes seem to sit under these themes? Am I missing something? And writing that initial results process is also going to be, writing that initial results draft is also going to be really helpful in that process. And just as a reminder, don't be afraid to cut codes or themes. You won't want to, it's like, you put all this effort into it, you put all this effort into producing this theme, and then to get rid of it is really hard, I guess, from a psychological standpoint. But sometimes you do need to be a little bit ruthless for the benefit of your overall analysis and paper. So things we want to look out for that we don't fall into when we're conducting a thematic analysis is having too many theme levels. That means too many overarching themes or themes and sub-themes with an overly complicated thematic structure, or an overly fragmented analysis. That means having too many themes. So how many themes you should put in? It's not a fixed rule, but the recommendations are typically for your standard 8 to 10,000 word paper. Anything more than 6 themes is going to be quite difficult to unpack in the results in a level of detail that you'll want to go into for a qualitative paper. So if you have more themes than that, often you can end up having these really thin descriptions that don't really go into it. So you might need to consider or revisit your analysis. And just a reminder that means that when you introduce more levels of thematic structures, so sub-themes and overarching themes, they also need to be unpacked in the analysis. So if you might need to reduce the overall number of themes if you're also trying to unpack sub-themes and overarching themes. So it's just something to keep in mind. So I've talked about this a little, but the kind of last step, I guess, is the last step before we write the results, is the defining and the naming themes. So this is a name or a label that captures the key idea of what the theme is about. And again, you want to try to have theme names that say something about the data rather than just labeling the content that's being discussed. So this is an example from a paper we did where we changed the theme names upon kind of some reflection. And you can kind of see with a relatively subtle shift, apologies for the word combination there, a relatively subtle shift. The ones in the blue, the theme names in the blue, tell us a lot more about the theme itself, and could be read independently of the data and still give you some sort of takeaway message. So if we look at the top one, experience of sport-based mental health promotion, that doesn't tell us anything about that data. If we were to read that theme name, we'd go, okay, I'm going to have to read the data to understand what the theme's about. But if we say sports-based mental health promotion is engaging, which was really the central underlying concept of that theme, you could read that theme name and go, okay, I know what it's about even without reading the data. So you can see how just reorientating the name around what the theme is about can be really impactful for understanding that thematic analysis. And the last thing is that the last step, is writing the results. So writing is part of the analysis. I really do suggest starting this early, even before you have final theme names, final theme structures. I find writing hugely important to being able to develop that thematic structure. Because as you go to write it, you might go, actually, this doesn't have as much as I thought it did, or wow, there's a lot more here to unpack than I've kind of thought there was. I might need to pull this apart a bit more. As you're going, you want to also provide analytical commentary. So what that means is you're using data to illustrate your analytical narrative, but you also want to bring in that analytical work yourself. So rather than just saying participant X said da 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 da, participant Y then said da 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 da, and this means da 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 da, you can kind of use the sentences between quotes to bring in the analysis, to show the concepts and the theories that could be going on here, that could be beneath them, and bringing that level of interpretation. So it's not just a series of kind of quotes that you're not really doing much in between the quotes with your writing. Now, again, that's a difficult skill, probably one of the more difficult ones through the writing process. So it's something that you will develop as you kind of edit your draft and get feedback from your co-authors. There has been this move towards more contextual information in the quotes we present. So using longer quotes, including sometimes the question that was asked for the quote. And that's obviously because if you use really small quotes, sometimes they can be framed in a way that doesn't really show the context of what was going on. But it is very difficult to always use longer quotes because you end up with this gigantic results section. So it's a bit of a balance where you can kind of pick and choose where it's most appropriate to use some of the bigger quotes. And you'll usually end up with some sort of table that kind of captures your codes and your themes with some data attached, so some examples of data. So here's one from one of my analyses where I've got the themes on the right-hand side. Sometimes you see it the other way, themes on the left-hand side, it doesn't matter too much. The codes in the middle, and then an example, one piece of data example that was used in that coding process. So each code would have had multiple pieces of data that were attached to that code. And typically what I try to do is use different examples of data in the write-up section than I've used in a table. So I'm not repeating the same data over and again. So I can show the different pieces of data that I've drawn from and show a bit more diversity in the data. As you can see in this, I've really tried to use very clear code and theme names to tell the reader what was going on within the data. Now, I'm sure this isn't a perfect analysis. I'm sure I could sit here and pick it apart, but hopefully gives you an idea of what a final analysis may look like. So one thing to highlight, and especially if you're putting in for journal review, for peer review, or maybe you're doing a master's thesis or a PhD thesis, even if you're not going to someone who is a qualitative expert, they might more come from a quantitative background. Most people have now heard this idea that themes do not emerge. So really avoid using the terminology emerge. Themes emerged from the data, for example, in your write-up. And you can see Victoria Clark talk around here why themes don't emerge. And if you remember back to kind of our philosophical position, and whilst there's no philosophical position attached to thematic analysis, we know that in qualitative research, at least epistemologically, we're always recognizing the role that the researcher plays within the data analysis, within the production of the data. And hopefully, as you've just seen, we choose the codes, we pick the names, we decide what gets cut, what gets included, we bring our theories in to the latent coding, to the researcher-derived coding. We have this huge role in the data, which means that really what we're doing is we're generating themes, we're developing themes, we're constructing themes. If you go back to our house analogy of the analysis as a house, we're the ones building that house. So the criticism of themes emerge kind of comes from this idea that the themes aren't just sitting there pre-existing in the data and we just kind of come pick them out, or they just kind of appear on our page. We're very much the ones pulling out that interpretation. We're doing the generation, the development, the construction. So I would really just a very small little hint of avoid using the terminology emerge, because it's such a commonly known criticism now. So it's something you'll really easily get picked up upon if you include it. So just to provide a quick summary, and then I'll briefly touch on rigour, trustworthiness, and validity. Qualitative data is complex, nuanced, and messy. And your job in the results section is to produce a report that provides clarity for the reader. So you want to capture that nuance and that complexity, but you want to capture it in a way that is clear to the reader and those reviewing the paper. I often refer qualitative research, and this analogy works quite well for a number of things in academia, but definitely writing a qualitative paper, I find this is the case, very similar to the Dunning-Kruger effect. So at the start, I always find that I'm doing the interviews. I'm like, yeah, I've got my theme names. I've got my themes in mind. I know what's going on in the analysis. I totally understand what this results is going to be. And then you really get into the thick of the coding process around midpoint in the analysis, and you really start to feel, I can't capture this. I've lost sight of the bigger picture. I'm in the thick of it. And I really feel like I don't know what's going on, or I'm never going to be able to provide this really clear report of all this complexity in the data. And as you just keep working through it, as you keep playing with different ideas, getting feedback, revising drafts, you kind of come out the other end and you really have a clear idea of what's going on. So the reason I include this is that if you do find yourself in the middle stage, please don't feel too disheartened. It's very much a natural process that in the middle of that analysis process, you can feel a bit like lost of what the bigger picture is. And that's when I really encourage seeking feedback. Okay, I'm going to briefly touch on rigour, trustworthiness, and validity. And I will have to be brief because we're short on time. But rigour or validity or trustworthiness, the terminology you use somewhat depends on your kind of philosophical position, but I won't go too deep into that. It's basically how well have we applied the methods in this study? So how well have we deployed different data collection methods, our data analysis? How have we ensured that we've done a rigorous, a trustworthy, a valid qualitative analysis? Now I'm going to go through, I guess, some of the common things that we have seen traditionally, and then some of the criticisms around that, as well as providing some potential suggestions around alternate options. So one really common thing we've previously seen is this idea of member checking. So member checking is when we conduct the analysis, then we give it to a participant and we say, does this accurately capture, what you talked about? So this is where the participant is basically assessing the trustworthiness or the credibility of the qualitative data and the results. So between 2000 and 2009, for example, in sport and exercise, 50% of qualitative studies use this methodology. But there's a range of issues. One of these is that member checking cannot deliver objective knowledge. So we're kind of assuming that that participant is the sole source of truth over all these multiple participant accounts and our interpretation of that data. And then what happens if the researcher and the participant contradict each other? What do you do in that scenario? Who's right? Is it the researcher or is it the participant? And in fact, in any of those papers that I mentioned, the 50% that have conducted member checking in the past, no one said that there was a disagreement, which just seems a bit funny. And then there's also power relations between the researcher and the participant. And there might be a reluctance on part of the participant to criticize the researcher or say something isn't valid. So one alternate option is what we call member reflection. So this isn't so much about saying these results are right or these results are wrong. It's about providing additional participants or the same participants to provide feedback, to provide more data, to explore any contradictions and differences within the data and explore it with the participant. So it's less about saying this analysis is right or wrong, and what do you think of this analysis? What have we missed? Is this capturing what you thought? Why is it not? And generating that data, and then that data would also play into the also be included in the analysis. So interrelated reliability. So this was a question that was raised in the chat beforehand. So a really common method, and this was used again between 2000 and 2009 in sport and exercise. 80% of qualitative studies use inter-rater reliability. And this is when two or more researchers independently code data and come to an agreement over the codes to check that the coding is replicable. So basically to ensure that there's, that, one person could code in the same way as someone else. Now, for a lot of philosophical approaches, this really doesn't work. And these philosophical approaches underlie most qualitative approaches, in particular reflexive thematic analysis. So we can't produce theory-free knowledge. So how I code something and how someone else codes something inherently is going to be different. There's also questions around power relations with this. So often it's the case that a supervisor and a PhD student might be doing the coding together. And a PhD student is unlikely to disagree with a supervisor over their agreement. So often one coder's perception takes precedence over another's. It's also unclear what agreement what agreement between the codes is the satisfactory threshold. So if you look through studies, you'll see all these different types, or all these different levels that have been applied to say there was an appropriate amount of inter-rater reliability. So an alternative solution that's been put forward is inter-coder reliability. And this is basically where we set up a coding framework that's very clear and it's deductive, which means that we establish a coding framework prior and we apply it to the data. It's a very post-positivist or neo or critical realist approach. It still faces some criticisms, particularly around producing quite superficial data because you're generating the coding framework before you conduct the coding. But it is an option if that's something you are looking to do. Another option which lends itself much more to kind of reflexive approaches is using critical friends. And this is something we often go through no matter what, especially if we're a PhD student or working with co-authors. So these are other researchers who provide a theoretical sounding board. And the purpose of critical friends is to challenge each other's construction of knowledge. So it's not about saying this is right or wrong. It's more about, have you thought about it this way? Does this way make sense? I'm not really understanding what you're saying here. Maybe you need to frame it in another way. So it's very much a traditional thing we would go through in getting feedback anyway. So it's a really common method and can be used across a lot of qualitative approaches. And very quickly, the last one that has often been applied is this idea of using universal criteria. So having a set checklist that we apply to a qualitative study, but there have been criticisms around this. So as you can see from Smith and McGannon here, it calls on a researcher to judge any piece of qualitative research, regardless of its intents and purposes in preordained and set ways. So the solution to using universal criteria is more around have a much more open-ended approach. So draw on different ideas and techniques around rigour and trustworthiness, and you can look these up in the research and different ways that have been used that are suitable to your research questions and the aim of your study. Awesome. I'll stop my screen share if I can. So I know that got a bit quick at the end there. I apologize having to squeeze it all in, but just quickly, did anyone have any questions before we finish up?
I just wanted to say thanks, Matt. I think that was really clear and really helpful. I had a quick question. It's more just half picking your brain for advice. Particularly when you're writing for publication, we have these quite strict word counts.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips for kind of striking that balance between making sure that we're doing the data justice, but also being succinct enough to kind of stay within the word counts that we need if we're publishing in a particular journal?
Yeah, so one of the ways is obviously to cut down other sections. So you might go a bit smaller in the intro. And then a lot can be done with really reflecting on, a lot of the time we include quotes that are quite long, but we're only really interested in the section that's key. And the other part doesn't actually provide useful context. So often when I've reviewed other students' work, there might be additional data that's included that isn't really relevant or providing context, and they're the things I suggest cutting. And then just being really, it's a type of writing, so you really got to edit, re-edit, and make it as tight as possible. You might also think about what quote might be better in a table and what might be better in the report, and using that different way to just cut down words. So it's a lot of just drafting and revising, besides kind of cutting some out of the intro and trying to be a bit briefer there. There's no real clear answer besides just lots of revising.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I think we've just got some questions in the chat as well. Chris has asked if member reflections are necessary if they're hoping to publish.
No, they're not necessary. They're just one method, and they're one that you'll have to obviously do beforehand, including ethics, for example, and that sort of stuff. So they're not necessary, but they are a good thing that you can use and also provide additional data. So it plays into things like sample size considerations as well.
Yep, cool. So we also had a question from Kevin. So do you have any tips on how to differently phrase codes and themes?
Yeah, so I think, Kevin, to your question there around sometimes using the same phrase for both, I would just reflect on whether that code is a theme or theme is a code, in the sense of the code should capture one idea and then the theme should have the kind of central organizing concept that sits along multiple ideas. So often that theme, I'm kind of capturing the overarching theme that's going on. The code is a bit more specific in the phrasing. And the phrasing, honestly, very similar to with regards to the writing, just a lot of work, lots of feedback, asking people different ideas, trying different scenarios. I would often just have lists of different things. And I found that quite helpful for generating that. So that would be the best answer I can give.
And then so Alice has asked, when you remove a theme, do you integrate that info elsewhere?
Typically with themes, I would find that I do kind of end up including that information somewhere. Not so much codes. Codes will be cut, but once I'm at the stage where I'm kind of at a theme thing, what I'm often doing is more, playing with where the codes kind of end up or how big the theme is or where its boundaries are. So that information still often gets brought in. I don't totally just remove it. Because I've usually kind of done that initial cutting before I'm at that thematic stage of building the themes. So it's more often, as you would have seen with that thematic map, I'm just kind of shifting, working out, well, maybe this is two themes or one theme. So the information doesn't normally stay. And I'm happy to answer another question, Alice, if you want.
Thank you. That was really helpful. Yeah, I tried to type it out and then I couldn't work out how to do it quickly. I noticed when you were coding in your spreadsheet, you would come up with a code and then you would copy and paste in that little section of text that related to that code. Do you recommend doing that as opposed to like having the full transcript and just highlighting that bit of text and then saying, I think that bit of text is this code? Like how do you decide between those two?
The way I do it, and I'll explain the reason I do it as well, but the way I do it is I'll have the transcript there and the codes there. Sorry, the Excel sheet there. I'll copy it over into the coding sheet. I'll give it a code name and I'll put the data in. I might give it it might fall under multiple codes. And then I'll highlight in the Word document that I've copied from. I'll just usually highlight it in a color to know that I've coded that piece of data. So when I come back through and do more coding, I know I've coded that piece of data. I don't specify which code it fell under because I'm going to change it. I'm going to play with it as it goes, especially in that initial coding. It's pretty rough and pretty just me thinking on the fly. The reason I don't use kind of highlighting and comments in a Word document is because I just find it much easier to then organize it by code. So you've got one code and, let's say 10 pieces of example data. I can go, okay, yeah, that's what is there, rather than sitting across multiple Word documents and I'm trying to find the different codes. And I also often, I like to go on the safe side and I would call overcode at the start. So I'll often have multiple codes on multiple pieces of data and really big codes, and I'll often cut a lot of it. So I think, in my first analysis, I might have 400, 500 lines in the Excel sheet, and I might only end up with, 20 quotes, 50 or 40 quotes or whatever, somewhere between that in total in the manuscript. But I just kind of put everything in that initial Excel sheet. I just find it a lot easier to work from there. You can also like Control F and stuff, which is really handy when you're trying to remember. I remember they said this word, but I can't remember where it was, and that little bits of those little tips which can help. So that's the way I do it. But again, there's no real fixed process how this is done. It's kind of what works for you.
Great, thank you.
No worries.
I think Amy
had a question. I have a question.
Yeah.
Great presentation. just a question in regards to writing up the results. So how much do we need to like quantify codes or themes in regards to like how consistent themes are across the sample, or like how many kind of participants experience that? I know some journals ask for quantification in qualitative research, some don't.
Yep.
So how do we kind of like toy that line?
In reflexive thematic analysis, it's very much meaning based, so I don't go anywhere near quantification. But if you're using content analysis approaches, so where you're reporting more on the content that's being said, often you'll see things like frequencies. If I do a thematic analysis, and I've actually had a friend go through this process where they put it in and they had feedback saying we want to see the frequencies, I would just go back to the journal and say no, basically, that's not, under the method that I'm using. This is why I'm not doing it. That if I were using that type of method, but if you are using a method that does include that, so types of content analysis, and I should say reflexive thematic analysis is one type of thematic analysis. There are others. So I've seen content thematic analysis, for example, where that might be more appropriate. So it really depends on the type you're doing, and obviously the journal you're going to. Obviously, if the journal you're going to calls for it, you might think, okay, well, maybe I'll align my analysis that way. But I've never done it myself, because a lot of the time you might even have, like, I'll have a theme and I'll have codes where the codes or the perceptions actually conflict within the theme, but the theme has an overarching idea. And then there's nuances and divergences between the participants. So kind of the idea that the more who said it is kind of more important doesn't really fall under necessarily a reflexive thematic analysis approach. So I know that's kind of a non-answer in a sense, but would be my way of approaching it.
Great, thank you.
I know we're a bit over time, but were there any other questions at all?
I did have one more question, and that is, how do you think ChatGPT will change?
I have had a conversation with a colleague about this, actually. So I think if you were to run something like a content analysis, it would probably work quite well. ChatGPT, I could imagine how that would work. You're looking for things around frequencies, you're looking for things around a semantic meaning. I think what would be hard from an AI perspective, and I'm no expert in AI, so I could be guilty of stepping into a territory I'm not familiar with, but I think what would be missed is kind of the researcher subjectivity. So the idea that I would code differently to someone else. So what would happen if we put transcripts to ChatGPT, it would probably produce the same report every time. Maybe we could ask it to code from different perspectives, but I don't think you'll get that nuance subjectivity that you would get from a researcher obviously doing it, because it's quite a creative and in-depth process that is inherently and impossible to separate from our own experiences. And that's not only just our knowledge, that's just our experiences in life. When I code stuff related to performance under pressure in sport, there's no way I can separate my own experiences with performing under pressure in sport. I'm not an elite athlete. It's not super relevant to the study, but I'm going to naturally view it through a way that is related to my own experience. So I think that's where AI approaches would struggle, but I could see it being used in quite an effective way when you're looking at more content-based analysis, frequencies, or synthesizing stuff at a bit more of a surface level approach, especially if you're dealing with really large sets of qualitative data. But I think it would stay relatively surface level. That's just an opinion. It's definitely not a right answer. So that's just my view, but I'm sure it will change as things evolve and progress.
Great, thank you.
Any other last questions for Matt? Cool. I might just stop